Construction work sites are usually made up of numerous different subcontractors. Although they may be working towards one common goal, every subcontractor will have their own unique scope of work. Within their specific scope of work, there are unique hazards that come with it. These hazards can then affect not only those creating the hazard, but those who are working nearby. It's because of this that OSHA has a multi-employer citation standard, which we will cover today. Hi, I'm Sergio with A&H Safety, and in this video, we will go over the multi-employer citation standard and the 4 different types of citable employers at a multi-employer worksite. Let's start by going over the definition of a multi-employer worksite, even if the name kind of gives it away. A multi-employer worksite is any worksite, permanent or temporary, where more than one employer and their employees work, usually but not necessarily at the same time. The most common multi-employer worksites are temporary worksites at which construction activities take place. Other examples include permanent worksites at which outside contractors perform activities at that workplace, including but not limited to construction, environmental or janitorial, repairs, and deliveries. For the sake of this video, we'll be going over and using the example of temporary worksites in which construction activities take place. Before the standard was adopted by CalOSHA, only the employer whose employees were exposed to a hazardous condition could be cited for the violation, even if they were not the ones who created the hazard. Now, to promote workplace safety and keep all employers accountable for their unsafe behaviors, all employers that took part in the violative condition can be cited. There are 4 different types of citable employers at a multi-employer worksite: the exposing employer, the creating employer, the controlling employer, and the correcting employer. Let's go over each type of citable employer, starting with the exposing employer. The exposing employer is an employer whose employees were exposed to the violative condition at the worksite, regardless of whether the employer actually created said condition. If the hazard was created by another employer, the exposing employer is still citable if they knew of the hazard or failed to exercise due diligence to discover and protect employees. Let's run through a quick example, shall we? Let's say your crew is working downwind to another employer's worker who is jackhammering concrete, for example, creating a cloud of silica dust. Your crew is then exposed to that silica dust as it blows their direction. If you, as an employer, allow your workers to work in that hazardous condition, you can be cited as the exposing employer. So what's the exposing employer to do in this situation? The exposing employer has the authority to correct the hazard, but in this scenario, the hazard derives from the action of an individual from another employer, so this is not feasible. If this is the case, the exposing employer should do each of the following. Ask the creating or controlling employer to correct the hazard. Don't worry, we'll go over these employers in a second. Inform its employees of the hazard and take reasonable protective measures. In extreme circumstances, the exposing employer can be cited for failing to remove its employees from the worksite to avoid the hazard. The next type of citable employer is a creating employer. And as the name reads, the employer is the one who actually created the violative condition. So if we use that same silica example we just covered, the employer whose employee was jackhammering the concrete without using a silica dust reducing measure would be cited as a creating employer. Now, if that employee creating the silica dust was also exposed to the harmful dust, they may also be cited as an exposing employer. Creating employer for creating the hazard, and exposing employer for exposing the worker to that same hazard. Moving on to the next type of citable employer. We have the controlling employer. A controlling employer is an employer who is responsible for safety and health conditions at the worksite and who has the authority to correct the violations. Evidence of an employer's control can be demonstrated in any of these 3 ways. 1, it can be demonstrated through explicit contract provisions pertaining to worksite safety. This means that an employer is a controlling employer because it has the power under a written contract to require other employers to adhere to safety and health requirements and to correct violations the controlling employer discovers. 2, where there is no explicit contract granting the right to control safety, or where the contract says the employer does not have such a right, an employer may still be a controlling employer. In this case, the power to control safety results from exercising or failing to exercise contract authority in a manner that directly affects the workplace. For example, if an employer controls the scheduling of a work and fails to adjust the work schedule when that becomes necessary to prevent a worksite safety hazard, then the employer becomes potentially citable as a controlling employer because of the direct connection between the employer's failure to act and the exposure of employees to the worksite hazard. In addition, an employer who controls the flow of essential information at a worksite can become citable as a controlling employer by failing to deliver information to another employer when that information is necessary to prevent exposure of employees to a worksite hazard. And the third way an employer's control can be demonstrated is through actual practice. Regardless of whether a contract exists regardless of what provisions it contains. An employer's control over worksite safety can be shown to exist by obtaining evidence of the employer's actual practices at the worksite. It is not necessary to rely on contract provisions as evidence of an employer's authority when such authority is clear from actual behavior among employer at the worksite. And finally, we have the correcting employer. The correcting employer is an employer who has a specific responsibility to correct the violative condition. A citable correcting employer is engaged in a common undertaking on the same worksite as the exposing employer and fails to exercise reasonable care to prevent or discover a hazard when it has the duty to do so. This usually occurs when the correcting employer is responsible for installing or maintaining safety/health hazards, such as a carpenter erecting a guardrail on another employer's property. And there you have it, the 4 types of citable employers in multi-employer worksites. It is also important to remember that the 4 categories of employers we just covered are not necessarily exclusive. Each type of employer may or may not exist at the particular worksite under inspection. In addition, an employer may fit into more than one category, such as the creating and exposing employer example that we used earlier in the video. I hope this video has given you a better idea of OSHA's multi-employer citation policy and the 4 types of citable employers in a multi-employer worksite, including the exposing employer, the creating employer, the controlling employer, and the correcting employer. If you have any further questions about this policy or need assistance with your safety program as a whole, feel free to contact us using the information provided below. We'd love to hear from you all in the comments as well. How do you think this policy helps promote safety and health on multi-employer worksites? Be sure to follow us on all social media platforms to stay updated with our latest safety tips and tricks. And as always, until next time, be safe and thank you.